Hello. In this quick video, I will share with you my top 2 ways that you can calculate your own NBA point spreads. I have 2 good methods that you can use to calculate your own NBA point spreads, which you can then compare to the Vegas point spreads. Today is Monday, February 26, 2018. All right. The first method involves ESPN's NBA Basketball Power Index, BPI. Basketball Power Index. Okay. ESPN NBA Basketball Power Index is a forward-looking measure of team quality. BPI uses advanced statistical analysis to measure each team's offensive and defensive levels relative to an average team. The central input to BPI is the score of every game. These scores are adjusted for a variety of factors: strength of opponent, pace, game location, distance traveled, rest. Along with BPI, the same factors as those listed above, sight, distance, rest, etc., can be used to calculate a team's average scoring margin and chances of winning in any given game. So the BPI is a power rating that can be used to generate a point spread and to attempt to predict future wins and margins of victory, point spreads. ESPN's NBA Basketball Power Index. How do you find it? Go to the ESPN site, NBA, scroll over to Power Ratings, and then you got BPI Power Rankings. BPI Power Rankings. And then that leads you into the discussion on BPI. So, this morning, today, February 26, 2018, ESPN published an updated Basketball Power Index, BPI, listing. Number 1, you have Golden State. Number 2, Houston. Number 3, Toronto. Number 4, Boston. And at the bottom, you have Phoenix, Sacramento, and Chicago. They have offense, defense, and overall BPI. And these numbers are all based on a hypothetical average team in the NBA. So to get the BPI, you add the offense and the defense. So for Golden State, 6.8 plus 2.1. And that gives you 8.9. So that's the relationship of these 3 variables. In order to calculate the point spread, we're going to be using the BPI. For today, let's use the example of a game that's being played today between Houston and Utah. Okay, so Houston and Utah are playing. Houston Rockets are on the road. Utah Jazz is the home team, and the point spread is -3 Houston. The road team Houston is -3. So let's see what happens when we calculate our point spread. Okay, so we're doing BPI here. BPI, Houston. Okay, Houston is 7.8. I'm looking at the BPI column. 7.8, and that would represent the expected margin of victory that Houston would achieve against a hypothetical average NBA team. And they're playing Utah. So Utah is here. They're ranked number 10, and their BPI is 1.5. So then what you want to do is subtract these 2 numbers. So basically Houston minus Utah. We're talking BPI here, and that would be 7.8 plus 1.5. We're adding these, minus minus. So 7.8 minus 1.5. 7.8 minus 1.5. You subtract the 2 BPIs. Okay, got it? And that gives you 6.8. So that's actually the point spread. Houston is the favorite, so they would be minus 6.3. Okay? Now, they're the road team. The road team gets plus 3 points. The home team is minus 3. So then, to get Houston's point spread, you would do Houston minus 6.3, and they're getting plus 3. That gives us a point spread of 3.3. That's using the BPI. So how does that compare to Vegas? Houston Rockets are minus 3. Amazing. Houston Rockets minus 3 is the Vegas line. Houston Rockets minus 3. And this is the ESPN scoreboard. And right here in the second column of their box here, Houston minus 3. Houston minus 3. So it's exactly the same. And this is one that you've calculated. That's calculated. All right. So that's using BPI. What's the next method? So in essence, the BPI is a point differential, okay, with adjustments for various factors such as strength of the opponent, pace, etc. One thing I'd also want to point out to you, this is kind of more of an advanced detail, is the BPI is based on 100 possessions. So the BPI is the number of points per 100 possessions. Now, in the NBA, a typical number of possessions in a game for a team is 100. On the high end, you have the Lakers and New Orleans. They average 105 possessions per game. On the low end, you have San Antonio and Memphis. San Antonio and Memphis average 98 possessions per game. As you can see, those numbers are pretty close, 105, 98. So basically, pretty much for all the teams, you can consider 100 possessions per game to be a typical statistic for this particular variable. Because there's such a small deviation from 100 among the NBA teams, it's reasonable to just straight use the BPI. Now in college it's different. Possession numbers range from 60 to 80, and so you have to adjust those numbers when you would be doing the college numbers. But for the NBA, there's typically 100 possessions per game, so you don't have to do any additional adjustments. All right, so moving on, that's using BPI. What we're going to do now is we're going to use point differential. This is going to be method 2. Method 2, and that's using point differential. Point differential is a lot more accessible. You can find it anywhere. Okay, so here we go. Let's do this. So we got the Houston Rockets. Now the Houston Rockets, on average, score 114 points per game, and they allow 105. Okay. To get the point differential for Houston, you would subtract these two numbers, so that would be 114.3 minus 105.5. Okay, offense minus defense. That's point differential. Hit return, and that gives you 8.8. That's Houston's point differential, and that's using the seasonal stats. How does that compare to the BPI? BPI is 7.8. They're just one off, pretty close. Keep in mind that BPI has adjusted for pace, strength of the opponent, etc. Now let's look at Utah. Utah, they average, here we go, right here in this corner, 103 points per game scoring. Defense 101.4 allowed. So the point differential for Utah is offense 103 minus 101.4. Offense minus defense. That gives you a point differential of 1.6. How does that compare to BPI? Utah's BPI is 1.5. Wow, it's almost the same. Okay, so now let's calculate the point spread. We're going to be using Houston's point differential of 8.8 and Utah's point differential of 1.6. So let's do this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the difference between the two. It's going to be Houston's 8.8 minus 1.6. Okay? Houston 8.8, Utah 1.6. All right? That, you want the difference? That gives you 7.2. Houston is the favorite, so they're going to be minus 7.2. All right? Houston's the road team, and you add 3. Okay? So to get the point differential, and this is going to be for Houston, you're going to do minus 7.2, and that would be Houston's point spread on a neutral court, neutral location, and then you're going to add plus 3. All right? Boom. That gives you minus 4.2. Alrighty. 4.2. How does that compare to the BPI calculation? BPI is minus 3.3. So it's just one off. Now, how does that compare to the Vegas point spread, as we saw earlier? The Vegas point spread is, for Houston is minus 3. So Vegas is minus 3. So Vegas is minus 3, using point differential it's minus 4, and using BPI it's minus 3. So essentially the same numbers. So now you have two methods that you can calculate your own point spread. So if you're wondering how Vegas calculates their point spreads, I don't know the details, but I would imagine it's very similar. This also tells you that Vegas, when they calculate their point spreads, they use as their base foundation or the infrastructure backbone for the calculation point differential. Because point differential is also the foundation or the dominant mathematical framework for BPI also. So keep that in mind. Point differential, seasonal stats. Now I have seen in the games, usually using these two methods, your point spread is going to be kind of close. But based on injuries and sometimes very recent performance, I have seen adjustments that Vegas has made to their lines. And and this is one way you can tell when there's an adjustment. If the line is the same as your calculation, it indicates that they haven't adjusted for new factors. If there's an adjustment, it means that Vegas has noted significant injuries or situational factors that would make them want to make an adjustment. Okay, so those are the two methods. As a bonus feature, let's talk a little bit more about stats. So those are the two methods. So I'm done with that conversation. An important concept in NBA basketball, you've probably heard the term parity, and that means that all teams are competitive on any given day. The bottom team can beat the top team. I guess that's theoretically possible. It can happen, and you see it happen. I mean, Houston Rockets, they have the highest win percentage. That's 78%, which means they've lost 22% of their games. Atlanta or Phoenix has the lowest win percentage. That's 295. So that means uh, they've lost 7% of their games, but that means they've won 30% of the games. So these are professional teams, and there is parity. Um, an interesting concept that comes up when I see. Now that doesn't mean all the teams are the same. It says that all the teams are competitive. From a statistical standpoint, I would say that this concept is very useful in that the way I like to think about it is clustering. Most of the teams, when I look at league-wide stats, most of the teams statistically are clustered together. And then you have outliers. Outliers are teams that are at the extremes, both at the top and at the bottom. Let me show you. So you have the Houston Rockets. They've won 78% of their games. But if you see most teams, starting from the Toronto Raptors, are within this cluster of 70% and 40%. Now you have outliers at the bottom who have won less than 40% of their games, and you have outliers at the top, such as Golden State Warriors and Houston Rockets, who have won above 70%. But the vast majority of teams are within the 70-40 range. 70-40 range. Actually, if you look at the clustering even more, Boston Celtics are 7%. Let me revise that. It's 60-40. So you have the outliers here above 60. You got Boston Celtics 60, basically 7%. Toronto Raptors 7%. Golden State Warriors 76%, 76.7%. Houston Rockets 78%. But the vast majority of teams are between 60 and 40. So 60-40, that's 50% win percentage plus or minus 10. So you got that midpoint of 50 plus or minus 10. So most of the teams are between 40 and 60, 50 plus or minus 10. That's a clustering. So in that case, when you have a team, basically there's two categories that you have to consider when you're looking at analyzing teams. Is ask yourself, is the team in that central cluster or are they outliers? If they're in the central cluster, then there's even greater parity. So a team that's in the central cluster, for example, Minnesota Timberwolves, they have a win percentage of 59%. A team like the Lakers or the Charlotte Hornets, who are at the bottom, more at the bottom, but they're still at the bottom of the cluster, they have a good chance of beating the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, so the teams in that central cluster have a greater deal of parity. So when you have teams in the outliers, that's when the statistics start to break down. Okay, so that's a very important concept, and you'll see this over and over and over again. So yes, is there parity? Yes, and but you have to know which teams are within that parity cluster and which teams are outliers. Now let's look at points scored. Similar kind of clustering. This cluster is between 100 and 110. Most teams in terms of points scored per game are between 100 and 110. So at the bottom you have Memphis Grizzlies 99%, Sacramento Kings 99%. They're actually close to 100. So we can actually include them in the cluster, but it's easy to remember 100. So 100 to 110. Teams above 110, there's only 4. You got Golden State, who score 116 points per game, Houston Rockets, who score 114 points per game, Toronto Raptors, who score 112 points per game, and the New Orleans Pelicans, who score 112 points per game. Everybody else is between 110 and 100. And even Toronto and New Orleans Pelicans, they're at 112. They're just 2 away. Once you get to Houston Rockets and Golden State, those are the major outliers. Okay? So just remember 100 to 110. Basically 105 plus or minus 5. So most teams are within that cluster. Let's look at defense. Defensively, the top 3 teams are San Antonio Spurs, who allow only 99 points per game. Boston Celtics, 99.8, basically 100. But they're still pretty close to 100. Then you got outside of 110, you have the New Orleans Pelicans and Phoenix Suns. Phoenix Suns have the worst defense; they allow 113. But 113 is only 3 away from the cluster of 110. So remember 100 to 110 for both points scored per game and points allowed per game. This will help you analyze the games. And also, too, keep in mind, ask yourself, is the team a statistical outlier? Are they at the extremes, top and bottom, or are they in the central cluster? When you look at the differential, you'll see that most differential being points scored minus points allowed. That's the margin of victory. Most teams are between +4 and -4. Boston Celtics is +3.7, and at the bottom you got here Brooklyn Nets at -4.4, Atlanta Hawks -4.5. So margin of victory, just kind of remember +4, -4, +5, -5. Then you have outliers: Chicago Bulls, Sacramento Kings, and Phoenix Suns. Phoenix Suns on average lose by 9 points per game. And then on the high end, I mean, there's symmetry in these statistics. It's very interesting. On the high end, you have the Houston Rockets with a positive point differential +8.8, Golden State Warriors +8.5, and Toronto Raptors +8.3. And you'll see this again, over and over again. The vast majority being within a central cluster, and then you'll have teams in the extremes. The teams on the extremes, the statistical outliers, are the ones that you have to keep in mind the most. Okay, it helps you remember. So when you're analyzing, you could look up the stats over and over again, but it's a lot easier to kind of make rules of thumb. For example, win percentage. Most teams are winning between 40 and 60. That's 50%, plus or minus 10%. Points per game scored, offense. Points per game allowed, defense. The range is 100 to 110. And just remember the outliers. Scoring, offensive outliers: Houston Rockets, Golden State Warriors. Defensively, you got Phoenix Suns at the bottom. And margin of victory, you got Sacramento and the Phoenix Suns at the bottom, Chicago Bulls at the bottom. At the top, you got Houston Rockets, Golden State Warriors, Toronto Raptors. Everybody else is +or -4. So that's where the parity comes into place. But if you assume parity, it's a false assumption because it's incomplete. You have to say parity plus outliers. Those are the two things that you have to keep in mind. Even possession, I mentioned to you, the range of possessions hover around 100 possessions per game. Lakers and New Orleans, I thought it would be tighter. Lakers and New Orleans is 105 possessions per game. San Antonio and Memphis, 98 possessions per game. They're all around 100. So may not seem like it, but when you look at all the teams and look at their stats, you realize that there is a lot of parity. But you must pay attention to the statistical outliers. All right, so I wanted to throw that in there because I thought that was an interesting statistical trend or phenomenon that you would be interested in. All right, today's February 26, 2018. Thank you for watching. Please share with your friends. Please subscribe. Please ask your friends to subscribe. Thank you.